myself, Bryant and Kerry Hampton, Lane Morgan, Gene Griffith, Rod Kelly, and Dottie Robinson. And the best way you can help the committee to do this, accomplish this task, is to go ahead and fill the sheet out and turn it in so that we can see where our needs and wants are and move from there to fill all the spots that need to be filled. But thank you again. It's always a challenge, but it's always a pleasant experience too to see people willing to give of their time and talents. Thank you. Thanks so much.
This past Wednesday night, we hosted our water game day for our children and families. Children played games and competed against each other during a great time of fellowship. If you would like to get involved in our growing children's program, please contact Pastor King. We are so excited about Vacation Bible School coming up in July. Many people have already volunteered to help out in different areas, but there are still plenty of volunteer positions to fill. If you are interested in any of these positions, or even in helping out with VBS in another way, please contact Pastor King. All students who are planning on going to Camp Castle, your $50 deposit is due today. The available spots for this trip are limited. Once you turn in this deposit, you will promise a spot for this trip. Middle and high school students, tonight we are playing extreme kickball. This is just like regular kickball, but playing on a giant slip slide. We will also eat dinner and continue our Canada series. Make sure to wear something to get wet in, and be here at 5:30 p.m. For all those on the youth committee, don't forget we are having our outing this Saturday, June 16th. We will leave the church at 2:30 p.m. and get back around 7:30. Students, we will also be traveling to Kersey Valley to play laser tag on June 24th. The cost of this trip is $25. We will meet at the youth building at 3 p.m. and we will return around 7 p.m. Any parents who would like to go are welcome to join in on the fun. Homecoming Sunday is coming up on June 24th. Make sure to mark your calendars. On Wednesday, June 27th, we are taking a children and family trip to the North Carolina State Zoo. Stay connected with us for more information about this event. To learn about more that's going on here at First Baptist Troy, make sure to stay connected with us through our social media accounts. We're glad you're here to worship with us today. Now, if you'll stand When he calls my name, no more sorrow, no more pain. I will rise on eagle's wings before my God. Fall on my knees, I will rise when he calls my name. No more sorrow, no more pain. I will rise on before you this morning. May we worship your name and we lift it high, God. Be with us this morning as we are your church. God, may we worship you in spirit and truth. God, we love you so, so much. It's in your holy, precious name we pray. Amen.
Good morning. Welcome to First Baptist Church. We're so glad you're here today, especially if you're here for the very first time. I know we have some first-time visitors right down front. This family I've met before. This is my nephew and his wife, Beth and Sean, and their three, Audrey and Joshua and Daniel, and there's one on the way. And this is my mother, Connie Harper. Would you stand, please? Turn around. You want to picture my sister? That's my mother. They've come all the way from New Jersey. If you come and visit us this morning, we're glad you're here as well. We'd love to know who you are. If you could fill out one of those welcome sheets, it's orange and the people in front of you, put that in an offering place that passes. We'd love to send you a letter of welcome, let you know how we can serve you, answer any questions you have, and pray for any prayer requests you might have. Put that in the offering plate when it passes in the line. We're glad you're here today. You know, the Lord is here with us. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, the Lord is with us. And we pray that today we'll leave this place different than we came in, because we've been on each other up with Christ. Let's stand together and sing a great hymn of praise.
It's good to see everyone here this morning. We'll sing 2 verses of All Creatures of Our God and King. And we'll give you a chance to welcome each other today, and especially welcome our visitors today. We'll ask our children to come forward, and then we'll sing the last verse together. All creatures of our God and King. All creatures of our God and King.
everyone. Does anyone know what a witness is? A witness is a person who sees something, and they oftentimes they testify in court, don't they? As far as they might see, just like you said, they see somebody do something bad, an accident, crime, or they might have to testify to someone's character, good or bad. They might have volunteered to be a witness, or sometimes they might be forced to be a witness by court order. So I'm taking it that none of you have been a witness in court, right? Have any of you been in a courtroom? Oh, okay, so. It was for you. You're supposed to say your dad. So she was actually in a courtroom this week with me. We got to see how government works, right? We all have to speak, so it's nothing bad, nothing bad. So, but oftentimes, you might have seen when they go to the witness stand, they have to, oftentimes, well, they have to stand up. Stand up and put their hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth. Let's try it. Younger, want to come with my swear to tell the truth? All right, so you put your left hand on the Bible. Do good job. I was first and your right hand up. And do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? Very good. Okay, wait. Right back. All right, where's the other parents? Y'all have anything that you need to know the truth of? All right, thanks for your help. Very good. So let's get back to our story, though. And, don't forget, you guys have the truth all day. Okay. So they have to say, they have to answer yes, and then the witness starts answering questions so that the jury can help make a decision on what needs to be done. And in our lesson today, Jesus was talking to his disciples after he had been raised from the dead. The disciples, didn't still quite understand the resurrection. Even though they had right in front of them, and they were talking to him, they still thought it was a ghost, and they were a little bit afraid. And you know what Jesus said to them? Why are you afraid? Why do you have doubts in your mind? Look at my hands, look at my feet, touch me. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones as I do. Then he asked them, do you have something to eat? Why do you think he asked them that? Have you ever seen a ghost eat? No, a ghost doesn't eat. So he took a piece of fish and he ate it to prove that he was not a ghost. Jesus helped his disciples understand the scriptures. He explained to them that the scriptures say that the Messiah must suffer, then in 3 days he will be raised from the dead. They also say that all people of every nation must be told in my name to turn to God in order to be forgiven for their sins. You're the Are you willing to take the stand and testify to the truth about Jesus? Very good. Excellent. Let's go to the Lord for prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for these children. Thank you for this congregation. Lord, help us to remember to tell others about you, to not be afraid to testify to the truth of who you are, who your Son, Jesus Christ, is as our Lord and Savior. Help us to know to share that with the world. In your name we pray. Amen.
It's now time for our offertory hymn. We have a new song this morning that goes along with our message, and the song is to the tune of Let All Things Now Live. It's called Young Joseph the Dreamer. Let's all stand and sing.
Young Joseph the dreamer was
harvest that you've entrusted us with. We thank you for all that you've entrusted us with, and by the way, worldly goods, and we thank you for the opportunity to give a portion of that this morning to honor you and to further your cause here and around the world. Lord, take these gifts that we offer this morning from cheerful hearts, and Lord, it is that you bring honor in the name of Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Thank you, please.
Thank
Sometimes something just needs to be said. When the emperor has no clothes on, when someone's zipper is down or their slip is showing, when someone is bullied or slandered or gossiped about, when wrong prevails, when foundations are destroyed, or when old prejudices, imagined to be principles, prevent progress and growth in ministry. I suppose on Sunday morning in church, something needs to be said. Not just anything to fill up the awkward silence, but not just something nice, not something funny, not something interesting to pass the time, but what needs to be said, the truth. Sometimes in a getting by world, it's just easier to keep quiet, to stand on the sidelines, not make waves or rock the boat. But to get ahead in a getting by world, sometimes it is necessary to have the courage to speak truth. Sometimes silence is not golden. Many young parents say silence is golden. But sometimes silence is yellow, cowardly. Sometimes, especially in the crisis, the situation cries out not for bystanders, but for upstanders who will stand up and have the courage to speak truth. And that is exactly what we find young Joseph doing this week in Genesis chapter 41. He is the great-grandson of Abraham, the grandson of Isaac, the son of Jacob, Israel, and he is a dreamer. But he has been crushed by life. Sold into slavery because of the jealousy of his brothers. Thrown into jail because of the lies of his master's wife. And then forgotten about because of the selfishness of the butler, as we saw last week. But he continues all along to get ahead in a getting-by world, rising from a slave to head of the house, from prisoner to head of the prison, and now today, because of his reactions, his determination to look for opportunities to serve, looking for not excuses to quit, but opportunities, Joseph is going to get ahead in a getting-by world. And today we're going to see him, as he has done all along, having the courage to speak up. He's done that when he had the courage to tell his dreams, when he reminded Potiphar's wife what sin was, when he asked the butler for a favor. But today in Genesis 41, he has a golden opportunity to speak truth, speak for God in front of the whole country, in front of Pharaoh. And he takes it. Join me in Genesis chapter 41, verse 1. It came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. Wait a minute, 2 full years. Joseph is forgotten in prison for 2 full years. Whatever became of those dreams of his greatness? Now he is a 3-time loser, a foreigner, prisoner on a life sentence with no hope of parole. Remember, he was 17 when he was sold into slavery. Chapter 41, verse 46 tells us he is now 30 years old. So there's 11 years split up between rising to head of the household with Potiphar and rising to the head of prison before interpreting the butler and baker's dreams in the last chapter. It's been 13 long years, but these last 2 full years must have seemed the longest. He gave word to the butler, "Get me out of here." And then for 2 full years, no word comes. Like we said last week, the butler did it. He forgot Joseph. Verse 1, Pharaoh had a dream. That's what Joseph was waiting for. And behold, Pharaoh stood by the river. Here is the river Nile. Pharaoh dreamed he was by the river, and the Nile was central to life in Egypt. Remember, this is where Moses would be drawn out of and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And this is where Moses would later grow when he grows up to confront a different Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 7. But here's where the dream takes a strange turn. Verse 2, suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows. Cows don't go swimming all the time, do they? Fine looking and fat. I suppose they started to put graffiti on the pyramids saying, "Eat more chicken." And then they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt, skinny cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh woke up. That was a strange dream. But Pharaoh's kind of sweating, and this was a real vivid dream. He tries to go back to sleep, and in verse 5, he slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then, just like the other dream, behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So again, Pharaoh awoke, and indeed, it was a dream. He goes back to sleep and has basically the same dream with just different characters. It's really strange, and there is the recurring number of 7, like the butler and the baker had with the number 3 last week. What does it mean? Pharaoh doesn't know, but he knows it's not a coincidence. It had to mean something. So verse 8, it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and he called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, not like Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. You remember he unreasonably asked them to tell him what the dream was, and then the interpretation. No, he tells them the dream. But there was no one who could interpret the dreams for him. Remember we said last week, dream interpreters were very important in ancient Egypt. It was a lucrative business. But unlike the butler and the baker, Pharaoh had access to professional interpreters. But none of them could do it. Could they not figure something up? Could they not make something up? Either way, they could probably tell it was probably bad news. Maybe they didn't want to tell Pharaoh. Maybe they didn't have the guts to tell him bad news was coming. But nobody says anything. So Pharaoh doesn't get what he wants. Verse 9, then the chief butler, remember him? Spoke to Pharaoh saying, I remember my faults this day. Here's his opportunity to move ahead. He says, I got a guy. I know someone. He also has to admit his faults because he hasn't told him before. I should have told you sooner like I promised to, but I totally forgot. Good excuse, right? Or maybe it's true remorse. I kind of doubt it. Verse 10, when Pharaoh was angry with the servants, remember you put me in prison 2 years ago? Put me in custody at the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now, you won't tell him the whole dream. But there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him. And he interpreted our dreams for us. Each man he interpreted according to his own dreams, telling him the story. In verse 13, it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Wow, he nailed it exactly. This is the guy he wanted. So verse 14, Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, go get this guy. But he's not ready for an audience with the king yet. Why, he's got to shave first, he's got to shower, probably smells in this prison. This is very historically accurate. Egyptians shaved, Israelites didn't. Does Joseph need to shave because he's been in prison and can't shave, or because he's a Hebrew and he wants to look like one? Either way, he can't come into the White House with a beard. So he's got to have a makeover. And with mind-numbing speed, he is ushered into the king's presence. I want you to imagine for a moment something like this happening to you. You're sitting in your house, maybe at the kitchen table, maybe on the couch, and all of a sudden the earth is shaking. You think it's an earthquake, or maybe the train is derailed and is coming into your front yard. But then you look out and it's a helicopter. And on the side is the emblem of the President of the United States, the Great Seal. It's Marine One. And some Secret Service agents rush out, knock on the door, and say, hurry up, get in. You're going to the White House. What? And they usher you into the helicopter, and you take a long flight, and you land at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And now they're ushering you into the Oval Office. Who, me? Would you be intimidated? Well, what do you think Joseph feels like? A little bit nervous? Verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream. That's why Joseph was in Egypt. That's why Joseph was in prison for 2 years, just waiting in the bullpen for Pharaoh to have this dream. And I've had a dream. There is no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. Now Joseph can see God's hand. Oh, that's why I was in prison. That's why I was able to interpret those dreams for the butler and the baker. Who told you? It wasn't his brothers. Little old me. Now, Joseph answered Pharaoh, verse 16, saying, it is not in me. Whoa, I can't do it. What happened to that skinny 17-year-old kid who was bragging about all the stuff that he could do? Remember, with all the pride, he told his brothers and his dad, his mom, everyone's going to bow down to me. Well, 13 years later, 13 years in Hard Knock University, have taught him a thing or two about humility. He says, it's not in me. Now, Pharaoh might think, have I got the wrong guy? But no, Joseph's not done. It's not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. How courageous do you think it is for Joseph to stand before this godless Pharaoh and tell him about the God of the Hebrews? Wow, pretty courageous, right? Bringing up God to an unbeliever, perhaps a hostile king who might take his head off. But I love what Joseph does here. Our first lesson for the day is we need to have the courage to glorify God before people. Joseph has the courage to glorify God before Pharaoh. Pretty important person, right? How does Joseph find this courage to bring up God in the very first sentence he says to the king? Because this is a pattern in his life, even in Egypt. When he was first sold into slavery, God blessed him in his service, but he was careful to tell his master that credit went to God. When his master's wife came on to him, he was clear that it would not only be betraying the trust of his master, her husband, but also a sin against his God. And last week, when the butler and the baker had dreams, he acknowledged his gift of interpretation, but he said it came from God. You see, it's what he's been doing all along. What you do in practice is what you will do in the game. If you goof off in practice, you're not going to make the big play in the big game. Don't imagine I can just do nothing all day, and then when my big opportunity comes, I'm going to shine. No, not if you haven't practiced. And so he has practiced all along. He has spoken up for God every time he's had little opportunities. Now the huge opportunity presents itself, and he delivers. So I ask you today, do we live in a world today that needs to hear about Almighty God? All you have to do is ask the question, right? Are they going to hear it in here on Sundays? Probably not. Why? Because they're not in here. So how are they going to hear? That means we're going to have to go out there and speak truth about Him ourselves. Well, how are we going to do that? We're not in the White House. We don't have a radio broadcast. I don't have a microphone. I don't have a talk show. I'm not in a televised award ceremony, or I'm not interviewed at halftime of the NBA championship and someone's sticking a microphone in my face. How am I going to give witness to Christ? Hey, you're not in prison like Joseph was either. You might have an opportunity this week. Take every little opportunity. Maybe a big opportunity will come, but take every little opportunity. Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:2, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. Now I know most of you probably think that's for preachers. And it's true. We have to be ready to preach every Sunday and on a moment's notice for every funeral. And I've also noticed we've got to be ready to pray at every social function we're invited to. But this is not just for preachers, because the word preach doesn't literally mean give a religious speech from a pulpit in a church. Actually, the word preach means to declare the word, to declare truth. Now, I am supposed to do that every week from a pulpit in a church professionally, but I better be doing that personally out there on the streets the rest of the week, and so must you. We have to be ready at all times to convince, rebuke, exhort, and we will if we're ready. Most of the time, we don't have the luxury of knowing when the opportunity will come. We're not going to get a chance to jot down some notes and get our thoughts together. We need to be ready in season and out of season. In season when it's planned and convenient, when it's out of season, when it's not planned or convenient. And then if we have the courage to take the opportunity when it arises, if we've practiced, we'll be able to say the right thing. It's like practicing the game. You've got to practice and practice and practice. When the game comes, you finally do have to step up the plate and take a swing. Well, we certainly see Joseph doing that. Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. Are you ready? What if someone asks you this week, why do you go to church? Why do you say bless you every time? Why Why do you do things differently? If you practice what you will say, then when the opportunity arises, maybe you'll say it. Now, the easy thing is to just make polite conversation. Can you imagine Joseph being a lot more like us, making polite conversation with Pharaoh? Pharaoh, sure is humid out there, isn't it? See the game last night? Or now he's in a throne room. What's the easiest thing to do? Flatter the guy. Oh, it's an honor to meet you, sir. Oh, you look so much younger in person, Your Highness. Or, I really love that song, Walk Like an Egyptian. But that doesn't take courage, does it? Anyone can make polite conversation. We need to tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. Because by definition, what they need to hear, they need to hear. Pharaoh wants to hear about his dream. What does he really need to hear about? He needs to hear about God. What do people you run into every day want to hear? Well, they want to hear how wonderful they are, how good they look. What they need to hear about is what's wrong with them, what they could do better. What I want to hear the doctor say is, you're fine. What I need to hear the doctor tell me is the truth, what's wrong with me. What we want the preacher to tell us is smooth things, tickle our ears, tickle our funny bones, make us feel better. What we need to hear the preacher tell us are the hard things, cut to the chase, not to make us feel better, but to make us better. We live in a world like Joseph's that is largely hostile to God. What the world needs now is truth, straight truth. There is a God. He made the world. He made you. And you will be judged by Him one day. He is our only hope. And the world needs some courageous truth tellers like Joseph. Not just mighty orators behind big pulpits, but ordinary people like you and me with the courage to glorify God before people. Can you do it? Okay, let's go back to our story in verse 17. Genesis 41, verse 17. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream," you said God gave you the gift, so here it is. "Behold, in my dream, I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly, 7 cows came up out of the river." He's going to give us a few details that we didn't hear earlier. Fine-looking, fat, they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. These were not Egyptian cows. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7 of the fat cows. When they'd eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them. They were still skinny. They're just as ugly as at the beginning, so I awoke. You ever had to tell your dream to somebody and it made sense until you started to try to tell somebody and it's a little bit tough. So that's what he's doing here. And then he tells him the other dream. "I also saw in my dream, suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. I called my dream team, and they were clueless. So this guy, the butler, told me about you." Verse 25, Joseph speaks a second time. And so, he says, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." So the first thing he says is, the dreams are one. That's the easy part. You and I could figure that out, right? They're so similar. He's not sticking his neck out, risking his reputation to say. But the second thing he says, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Again, Joseph not only mentions God, but he gives glory to him. He didn't say Almighty Pharaoh, he says Almighty God. He says, verse 26, 7 good cows are 7 years. 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. Remember last week, 3 baskets are 3 days. Why are the cows years and not days? I don't know. I don't have the gift. He knows it's 3 days. He knows it's 7 years. The 7 thin and ugly cows which come up after them are also 7 years. And the 7 empty heads, blighted by the east wind, are 7 years of famine. Wow. Doug Hedges bets, doesn't qualify it with about, give or take, around. So he says 7 years. 7 years good, 7 years bad. He has just given a 14-year weather forecast. That's putting his neck out there, isn't it? Now, this is an amazing prophecy, not because it's 14 years, but also because Egypt was not subject, like the rest of the world, to famine. Why? They weren't dependent on the rains. They were dependent on the river and irrigation. They had very few famines, but they kept meticulous records, and there is record of one that lasted 7 years. What do you know about that? And then verse 28, he says, "This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." A second time, he says, "I've spoken it. I'm speaking up, but I'm not going to do it. God is about to do this." He gives the credit to God. Verse 29, "Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe." Have I been clear enough? It's going to be bad. That's why God's told you about it. Oh, why 2 dreams? Verse 32. "The dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God. And God will shortly bring it to pass." You notice how many times he keeps on bringing up God? So when do the good years start? Well, they've already started. You're on the clock now. But again, I love what Joseph does here. Joseph has the courage to tell people what God is doing. He stands up and says there is a God, but then he dares to tell a pagan world what this God is doing. Sometimes, even we don't fully understand what God is doing in our world, what he's doing in our lives. You ever wonder, hey God, what's up with those Christians getting persecuted over there? What's up with this crazy country where they're legalizing this and redefining that? Hey God, what's up with me losing my job? God, what's up with me losing my marriage, my child getting sick? What's up with me losing my loved one? You want to know what God is doing? Then you need to read this book. Don't wait for a dream. Pick up the book. He's doing what he's been doing since the first Easter Sunday morning. He's changing the world one person at a time. He's drawing people to himself, forgiving sinners, rebuilding broken homes and lives, working all things together for our good if we love him, as we see in Romans 8:28. Do you want to know what God is doing so you can tell others what he's up to? Then you simply have to read and study this book. God has shown us what he's doing. You know, there are so many churches and so many Christians who are getting away from this book because they think it's obsolete, politically incorrect. And they are saying, if they say anything, what they think the world wants to hear, not what it needs to hear. But actually, we need to have the courage to tell people what they need to hear. They need to hear the truth. Jesus said in John 8:32, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." What does that mean a lie will do? A lie will put you into bondage. We don't need to defend the Word of God. How do you defend a lion? You don't need to defend a lion. Just open up the cage and let it out. It'll take care of itself, right? You don't need to defend the Bible. It is the power of God to salvation. All you need to do is just open it up and let it out of its cage. We don't need to water down the truth to make it relevant to today's world. It is relevant. All we need to do is declare it. I believe when we attempt to have it both ways, to be nice and not offend anyone, we make ourselves irrelevant. If people want to hear, "I'm okay, you're okay," they can hear that anywhere. If they want to hear the real truth, where else can they go to hear how God breaks addictions, repairs broken relationships, forgives sin, removes guilt, strengthens the weak, heals the broken? Friends, if we sacrifice the truth in some ill-advised attempt to be relevant, we sacrifice both relevance and truth. Now, on the other hand, too many churches and too many Christians use this book as a sledgehammer to destroy others and make themselves feel good. Too many so-called believers are quick to give you a piece of their mind. And the truth is, they can ill afford to give away many pieces of their mind. They haven't got much left. They use the truth as an excuse to be rude. But Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, to speak the truth in love. Too often, for too many people, Telling it like it is an excuse to be opinionated, rude, and unchristlike. Just being honest, people say, to cover being mean and petty. Saying what needs to be said is more than just saying what I want to say. Not saying what I need to say, it's what they need to hear. It's not getting something off of my chest. So I think it's important that if we're going to get ahead into getting by the world, we can't be the person always giving people a piece of our mind. The person who, like a terrorist, bombs them with the truth and runs away. We need to tell them what they need to hear, not what we want them to hear. Joseph, of all people, had a reason to be furious, to tell off the Pharaoh and all of Egypt. Do you know what I've been treated like here for 13 years? He had a chance to sound it off, tell it like it is, give him a piece of his mind. But he didn't. And neither should you and I. Speaking the truth without love is brutality. Speaking love without truth, that's hypocrisy. Yes, speak the truth. Say what needs to be said. But what they need to hear, and say it in a way that they will hear it. Speak the truth in love. Today is the day of Twitter. When presidents and college professors and preachers get in trouble, athletes get in trouble, because they get on Twitter and they say something without thinking about it. All of a sudden they try to retract it. Someone's already spread it around the internet, and they get in trouble. We need to be careful what we say and how we say it. What does Joseph do here? He doesn't have the nerve to tell people what he wants, but he has the courage to tell people what God is doing. And that truth will set them free. It's not his opinion that will just tick them off. Let's go back to the story in Egypt. Verse 33. Now therefore, he says, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man. Anyone? Anyone? And set him over the land of Egypt. Pharaoh didn't ask him what he should do. Pharaoh said, what did the dream mean? Joseph now has the courage to tell him what he needs to do. He tells him the truth. He tells him what God is doing. And then he turns around and he tells him, here's what you should do. Hey, who do you think you are, Joseph? Well, Joseph has earned the right to tell Pharaoh what he should do, don't you think? Pharaoh, you need to select a discerning and wise man. Set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5, what's that, 20%, of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. Let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and then keep the food in the cities. Now you see what he's done here. He said, I want you to go out and start a taxation program. Pharaoh needs to know what to do. He doesn't even know it. Is this presumptuous? He's just a slave turned prisoner. Tell the king what to do? Would this take courage? Yes. But here's Joseph's advice. I want you to set up a 20% tax on the harvest for the next 7 years. What would that give him? 140%. Really enough for 1.5 years. Now, to you, 20% tax sounds high, right? But if you think about our income tax, state, federal, sales tax, and every other tax, 20% starts down pretty good, doesn't it? But it will save lives. It's really good advice. So do you see what he is doing here? A third thing he does, he has the courage to tell people what they should do. Look at the verbs in verses 33 through 35. Let Pharaoh select. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint officers. Let them gather food. Let them keep food in the cities. This is a strange grammar to us. It's called the third person imperative. I'm sorry for the grammar lesson. We have imperative verbs, but they're always second person. Go answer the door is you go answer the door. Tie your shoes is you tie your shoes. Straighten up your act. Keep your elbows off the table. It's always you. We don't have a way of saying he picked that up. She turned off her blinker. They follow me. No, we only say it to the person we're addressing. But in Hebrew and in Greek, they had second person imperative and third person imperative. So the only way we can translate this is let Pharaoh. But he's actually saying, Pharaoh, you select a wise man. Pharaoh, you do this. Wow, pretty confrontational, don't you think? It's a command. Who does Joseph think he is? I'll tell you who he is. He's a man who's got a plan. He's a man who knows what God is doing. And he's a man who knows what we should be doing. So what else can he do but tell us? I love 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 32. Every year as I read through my Bible and come on this verse, it leaps off the page at me. 1 Chronicles 12:32 says, the sons of Issachar had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. Now, I don't know much about the sons of Issachar. I don't know their names. I don't know their living conditions. But I want to be like them. I know some people today who are news junkies and they fancy themselves as having an understanding of the times. They've got Fox News on 24/7. They know the latest legislation, the latest polls, the latest developments. But friends, that's only the news. That's only what is supposedly new. It's not the truth, and it's not what we really need. The news can only tell you what is going on, but only God can tell you what you ought to do. And so this is what we need to pray for. God, give me the wisdom to know what I ought to do. Give me the wisdom to know what my friend ought to do, so I can give them some godly advice. If you want to know what they ought to do, again, you need this book. You need the wisdom of God. To be like Joseph, to be like the sons of Issachar, and know what people should do, we need to know the book. James says in chapter 1, verse 22, be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Remember, the important question is not, why did this happen, but what can I do? The important thing to know is not what's happening around the world, but what I should do, what we should do to change our world. The important thing is not to hear and read and study God's word, but to do it. Read it and study it, great, but if you don't do it, you're worse off. Friends, if we are not practicing what we preach, we have no right to tell anyone else what they should be doing. Joseph is not some busybody telling Pharaoh what he should do while he is in not self doing what he can. Joseph has earned the right to tell Pharaoh what God wants him to do. He's talking not about himself, he's talking about God. He told Pharaoh not what he wanted, but what God was doing. He showed himself wise and trustworthy, just like he did in Potiphar's household, just like he did in the royal prison. Not by being bossy, giving unsolicited advice and telling people what to do, what he would want them to do. No, he earned the right to tell them what God wanted them to do. That got Joseph ahead in a getting by world. Look what happens. Verse 36, then that food shall be reserved for the land. And verse 7, so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God dwells? Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. Wow. The bratty kid who made his brothers angry by proudly telling them that they would bow down to him has learned now how to give advice that would be heard by a king. He says it in a humble way. Maybe you ought to consider it. Have you thought about it? Pharaoh says, God has shown you all of this. He has certainly earned the right to be heard. So he says in verse 40, you shall be over my house. This is the third time we've seen this in Egypt. He's a slave in Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh says, you're going to be over my house. He goes to prison. And the prison guard says, you're going to be over the prison. Now he is in the throne room. And the king says, you shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand, put it on Joseph's hand. He clothed him in garments of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, and he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, bow the knee. Egypt's bowing down to Joseph. Soon his brothers will join the crowd. So he set him over the whole land of Egypt. Jewelry, new clothes, new ride. This is the original rags, the richest story. Talk about a dream come true. Do you think Joseph got the willies? Whoa, all this in a day. This morning I woke up in prison in a foreign land with no hope. And now I'm running the country? My goodness, his head must have been spinning. Pharaoh said in verse 44, I'm Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paaneah, and he gave him his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar. Now he's his son-in-law. So Joseph went out over the whole land of Egypt. He's got an Egyptian clothing. He's got on Egyptian robes, an Egyptian wife, an Egyptian name. He sits on an Egyptian throne. But what made him great was an Israelite God. And the way, as we saw, Joseph reacted by not getting bitter, but by getting better. By the way he looked for opportunities to serve rather than excuses to quit. And we see this week by having the courage to speak truth. It was unpopular, politically incorrect, and risky. I'm not saying that if you do these things, you're going to become the next president of the United States. Probably not. But I am saying that getting ahead in the getting by world doesn't mean necessarily riches or power or fame. What I do mean is getting ahead in God's kingdom. And we will if we do more than just get by with what comes naturally, what we've always done. In our God-hostile world, we need a few Josephs who, in the crisis, in the everyday, will be more than just bystanders, but upstanders, having the courage to speak truth. Friends, this week, as I prepared this message, God laid on my heart, do you practice what you preach? Are you more worried about what people will say, how they will feel about you? And so I had to make some phone calls and tell people what God was doing in my life and what I thought God wanted them to do. Maybe they won't listen. Maybe they won't speak to me again, but I need to have the courage to speak truth. Some of you need today. It's not the emperor has no clothes on. It's not some slip showing, but someone needs to hear the truth about God, about their life. And if not you, who? Let's pray. God, thank you for the story of Joseph, a very graphic example of how you can use a person in the lowest place to have a great influence. And Lord, I pray that you'd help us to do more than just go along, to get along. Lord, I pray that you'd help us to have the courage to speak truth. Lord, someone needs to preach truth to this lost and God-hostile world. Help it to be us this week. Lord, help us in practice to do what we would and should do on the big stage. Help us to speak up for you. Help us to have the courage to tell people about you and what you're doing in our lives. In Christ's name we pray.